The taste of ancient bronze still floods my mouth when I remember the moment I first touched his mind across the warp. I am Malcador the Sigillite, last witness to truths that would shatter the faith of billions if they knew what their god-emperor truly was before he claimed that throne. You think you know the story of the master of mankind, how he united Terra, launched the Great Crusade, and sacrificed himself to save humanity from chaos. But you don't understand what I've seen burning in those golden eyes for 15,000 years. The man you worship as divine was born in the valleys of ancient Anatolia as something far stranger than any prophet or king. His first death came at the hands of his own father, when shamans realized their reborn godchild would consume them all to achieve immortality. Every triumph you celebrate, every sacrifice he's made, has been building toward a moment of transcendence that will either elevate humanity beyond every limitation, or destroy our species entirely in the pursuit of godhood. Chapter 1. The Birth of a God. The shamans of old Earth knew they were dying long before the first crude settlements along the Indus began practicing agriculture. I've spent centuries studying the fragmentary records they left behind, carved into stone, burned into clay, written in languages that predate human civilization by millennia. What they feared wasn't physical death, but something far worse: the gradual awakening of psychic predators in the warp that would consume their souls upon bodily demise instead of allowing peaceful reincarnation into new flesh. The ritual they devised in response would have been called heretical by any imperial authority that discovered its true nature. But desperation drives even the wisest minds to embrace solutions that violate every moral principle they've held sacred. 8,000 shamans from across Terra's primitive continents gathered in the hidden valleys of what would later become Anatolia, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of humanity's earliest encounters with the supernatural. The man who would become the emperor was never intended to be what he ultimately became. The shamans sought to create a protector, a perpetual guardian whose reincarnating soul could guide humanity through the dangers that psychic awakening would bring. What they achieved instead was the birth of something that transcended every category they understood, a consciousness that combined divine power with human ambition in ways that would reshape the galaxy. I was there, though my memories of those early years exist in fragments that consciousness chooses to recall or suppress according to purposes I've never fully understood. The ritual required voluntary death from every participating shaman, their souls merging through techniques that predated written history, but operated according to principles that modern imperial psychers would recognize as variations of possession and soul binding. The child born from this collective sacrifice appeared physically unremarkable, another infant among the scattered tribes that roamed Anatolia's river valleys during Terra's prehistory. But those who possessed psychic sensitivity could perceive the wrongness that radiated from his presence like heat from a forge. This wasn't simply a powerful psyker, but rather something that existed simultaneously in material reality and the warp itself, bridging dimensions that were never meant to intersect so completely. His adoptive parents were herders who understood nothing of the cosmic forces that had shaped their foundling's nature. They named him according to local custom and raised him alongside their own children, never comprehending why their livestock grew healthier in his presence, while predators avoided their settlement entirely. The shamanic consciousness that had created him remained dormant during these early years, allowing normal human development while slowly building toward awakening that would announce itself through events that violated natural law. The first manifestation occurred during his 7th year, when raiders from a rival tribe attempted to capture the settlement's children for slavery. The boy who would become the emperor responded to the threat with instinctive use of psychic powers that incinerated 43 armed warriors in seconds, leaving behind only ash and the smell of burned copper that would forever mark his use of the warp. His adoptive family, terrified by what they'd witnessed, drove him from their settlement with prayers and protective charms that proved entirely useless against abilities that transcended their understanding. Exile forced premature awakening of the shamanic memories that had been implanted during his conception. As he wandered through landscapes that were slowly recovering from the last ice age, the accumulated knowledge of 8,000 ancient psychers began emerging in his consciousness, like sunlight through clouds. languages that hadn't been spoken for millennia, techniques for manipulating reality that required no technological enhancement, understanding of cosmic forces that wouldn't be documented in imperial records for thousands of years. But knowledge without context created its own form of torment. The shamans had sacrificed themselves to create a guardian for humanity, but they'd failed to provide adequate guidance for how that guardianship should be exercised. The emperor found himself possessed of power that could reshape continents, but no clear understanding of what goals justified using such capabilities. The moral framework that would eventually drive his conquest of Terra was something he developed through trial and error across centuries of experimentation. The early years were marked by attempts to live as an ordinary human, despite possessing abilities that made normal existence impossible. He took names and identities that would be forgotten by history, sometimes serving as advisor to primitive kings, other times choosing isolation in wilderness areas where his presence wouldn't terrify the populations he'd been created to protect. Each experience taught him more about human nature and the psychological mechanisms that governed how societies responded to leadership that exceeded their comprehension. The pattern that emerged would characterize his entire relationship with humanity throughout the ages that followed. Direct revelation of his true nature inevitably triggered fear and religious worship that prevented rational cooperation, while concealment of his capabilities limited his ability to provide effective guidance. The balance between revelation and concealment became a strategic consideration that would influence every major decision he made across 15 millennia of hidden influence over human development. The first civilization that he attempted to guide directly was the kingdom of Shuruppak in ancient Mesopotamia, where he served as chief advisor to a king whose name has been lost to history, but whose achievements laid foundations for agricultural techniques that would sustain urban populations for millennia. Working through intermediaries and carefully limited displays of foresight, he demonstrated how technological advancement could be achieved without triggering the social disruption that usually accompanied rapid change. But success in Shuruppak revealed the fundamental limitation that would constrain his efforts throughout the pre-imperial era. Human societies that achieved prosperity and stability under his guidance inevitably attracted the attention of neighboring groups whose response to advancement was conquest rather than emulation. The kingdom he'd spent decades building was destroyed by raiders who possessed inferior technology but superior numbers, demonstrating that isolated improvement was insufficient for long-term human survival. The destruction of Shuruppak convinced him that piecemeal intervention would never achieve the systematic transformation that humanity required to survive in a galaxy where psychic awakening was attracting increasingly dangerous attention from warp entities. Protection required coordination on scales that exceeded any political structure that primitive human societies could maintain through conventional means. The only solution was direct rule by consciousness, capable of enforcing unity through methods that transcended ordinary political authority. Yet implementing that solution required developing capabilities that the shamanic consciousness had never possessed. The shamans had been healers and guides whose power operated through cooperation and consent. Conquest demanded different skills: military strategy, political manipulation, and above all, the psychological techniques necessary for controlling populations that might resist unification for their own good. The emperor spent the next several centuries developing those skills through careful study of human conflict and social organization. He served with countless armies, observed the rise and fall of hundreds of civilizations, and gradually developed understanding of the factors that determined whether societies survived or perished when faced with external threats. Most importantly, he began experimenting with methods for inspiring loyalty that transcended rational self-interest. The breakthrough came during his service with the armies of Sargon of Akkad, where he discovered that humans possessed an inherent tendency to follow leaders who demonstrated capabilities that exceeded normal limitations while maintaining apparent humanity. The key was calibrating revelation, showing enough power to inspire confidence without displaying so much that followers would worship rather than cooperate. But even refined techniques for leadership had limitations when applied to civilizations that remained vulnerable to external threats beyond their ability to resist. The Akkadian Empire fell to Bronze Age collapse, despite his best efforts to strengthen its institutions and military capabilities. The pattern repeated across dozens of other civilizations as he refined his understanding of what systematic human improvement would require. The conclusion was unavoidable. Lasting protection required not just superior technology and organization, but transformation of human nature itself to eliminate the psychological factors that made sustained cooperation impossible. The species needed to evolve beyond the limitations that prevented achievement of true unity. But that evolution required guidance by consciousness that understood both current human nature and the potential that lay dormant within the genome. Standing in the ruins of yet another civilization that he'd failed to save from its own limitations, the Emperor made the decision that would define the remainder of his existence. Instead of continuing attempts to guide humanity through influence and example, he would take direct control of the species' evolutionary development, using whatever methods proved necessary to forge a unified human empire capable of surviving the cosmic threats that were already gathering in the warp. The age of hidden guidance was ending. The era of conquest was about to begin, and he would need to become something far more terrible than the benevolent protector that the shamans had intended to create. Humanity's salvation would require transforming their savior into a tyrant whose methods would violate every moral principle that had motivated his original creation. But the alternative was extinction, and he had seen enough civilizations die to understand that mercy was a luxury that endangered species could not afford. Chapter 2: The Hidden Years. The millennia that followed the collapse of the Akkadian Empire marked the beginning of what imperial historians would classify as the Emperor's hidden years, though they had no comprehension of how extensively he influenced every major development in human civilization throughout the classical period and beyond. I've pieced together fragments of his activities from sources that span continents and cultures: Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Greek philosophical texts, and Roman administrative records that contain subtle traces of his interventions. The pattern that emerged during these centuries revealed the sophistication of his long-term planning and the patience that divine consciousness could exercise when working toward goals that required fundamental transformation of human nature itself. Instead of attempting direct rule that would trigger resistance and religious disruption, he began implementing systematic modifications to human development through methods that appeared to be natural cultural evolution. His presence in ancient Egypt began during the reign of Pharaoh Nahma, when he served as an advisor whose council on agricultural management and administrative organization laid the foundations for the civilization that would dominate the Nile Valley for 3,000 years. But his true purpose involved conducting experiments in large-scale social control that would later inform imperial governance methods used throughout the galaxy. The pyramid complexes that arose under his guidance weren't simply monuments to royal ego, but rather sophisticated research facilities designed to study the relationship between architectural geometry and human consciousness. The precise mathematical relationships encoded in their construction created resonance patterns that influenced the psychological state of populations living within their sphere of influence, generating social harmony and cooperation that exceeded anything achieved through conventional administrative methods. But the most significant Egyptian innovation was the development of mummification procedures that preserved genetic material for analysis techniques that wouldn't be formalized until the dark age of technology. Working through priest-scientists who believed they were serving religious purposes, he collected biological samples from thousands of individuals whose bloodlines showed evidence of emerging psychic potential, building comprehensive databases that would later inform the genetic modification programs used to create the primarchs. Similar research operations were established throughout the Mediterranean world as he carefully cultivated multiple civilizations simultaneously, using each culture to explore different aspects of human development while maintaining the isolation necessary to prevent cross-contamination of experimental variables. The philosophical schools of ancient Greece provided laboratories for testing different approaches to education and intellectual development, while Roman military organizations allowed systematic study of command structures and loyalty mechanisms. His influence on classical Greek civilization proved particularly crucial for developing the theoretical frameworks that would later underpin imperial political philosophy. Working through figures whose historical identities have been carefully obscured by subsequent imperial editors, he introduced concepts about the relationship between individual excellence and social harmony that would eventually inform the hierarchical structures used throughout human space. The academy that Plato established in Athens operated according to principles that had been refined through centuries of experimentation with consciousness development techniques. The philosophical dialogues that emerged from these discussions explored questions about justice, truth, and the relationship between material reality and transcendent principles that wouldn't be fully understood until the Great Crusade revealed their practical applications. But the most important Greek innovation was the development of mathematical frameworks for understanding cosmic geometry and the relationship between consciousness and physical law. The theoretical work conducted by scholars who believed they were pursuing abstract knowledge actually laid foundations for technologies that would later enable faster-than-light travel and direct manipulation of probability patterns through focused mental discipline. Roman civilization provided opportunities for testing administrative and military innovations on scales that dwarfed previous experiments. His influence on Roman legal development established precedents for imperial justice that would be recognizable to any High Lord of Terra, while military reforms introduced organizational principles that would later be adapted for Space Marine Legion structure. The gladiatorial games that became central to Roman entertainment served purposes beyond public spectacle. They were systematic studies of human psychological response to controlled violence that informed later understanding of how warrior cultures could be shaped and directed. The detailed records maintained by Ludus managers provided data about training techniques, mental conditioning, and the factors that determined whether individuals developed toward heroic excellence or destructive brutality under combat stress. But his most ambitious Roman project involved the establishment of mystery cults that operated alongside conventional religious institutions while pursuing knowledge that would later become central to imperial psychic development programs. The initiates who participated in these cults believed they were seeking spiritual enlightenment, but they were actually test subjects for techniques that enhanced human consciousness through controlled exposure to warp phenomena. The cult centers established throughout the empire operated as research facilities where carefully selected individuals were exposed to experiences that pushed the boundaries of normal human perception without triggering full psychic awakening. The data collected from these experiments provided crucial insights about the relationship between mental discipline and supernatural ability that would later inform Astarte's psychological conditioning programs. The collapse of Rome marked the end of classical experimentation and the beginning of a new phase focused on preserving essential knowledge through the chaos that would characterize the following centuries. As barbarian migrations disrupted established administrative systems, he transitioned from active research to protective concealment of discoveries that would be needed for humanity's eventual reunification. The monasteries that arose throughout post-Roman Europe served dual purposes as religious institutions and secret libraries where crucial texts were preserved by scribes who understood nothing of their true significance. Mathematical treatises on geometric principles, astronomical observations about stellar phenomena, and philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness were copied and recopied by monks who believed they were serving God while actually maintaining the knowledge base that would later support imperial technological supremacy. But the most important medieval innovation was the development of alchemical traditions that explored the fundamental structure of matter and energy through methods that combined rigorous experimentation with theoretical frameworks that wouldn't be validated until the development of atomic theory. Working through scholars who believed they were seeking spiritual transformation, he laid foundations for understanding of physical law that would later enable the creation of power armor, void shields, and the countless other technologies that made human galactic expansion possible. The Crusades provided opportunities for field-testing military innovations and psychological conditioning techniques on scales that exceeded anything possible during peacetime conditions. The religious fervor that motivated Crusader armies was systematically studied and refined until it became a template for the fanatical loyalty that would later characterize Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine chapters. But beyond military applications, the Crusades served as cover for archaeological expeditions that recovered artifacts from civilizations that had flourished during Terra's distant past. Many of these discoveries provided evidence of previous human achievements that had been lost during various catastrophes, confirming his theories about cyclical rise and fall patterns that could only be broken through permanent unification under guidance that transcended normal human limitations. The Islamic Golden Age provided different research opportunities focused on mathematical and astronomical developments that would later inform navigation techniques used during the Great Crusade. The scholars working in Baghdad and Cordoba believed they were expanding human knowledge for its own sake, but they were actually developing the computational frameworks that would later enable accurate warp travel across galactic distances. Most significantly, Islamic preservation and expansion of classical Greek philosophical works ensured that crucial theoretical foundations weren't lost during the chaos that followed Rome's collapse. The commentaries and elaborations produced by Islamic philosophers refined understanding of consciousness and reality in ways that would later prove essential for psychic training programs used throughout the Imperium. By the end of the medieval period, he had established comprehensive networks for preserving and developing the knowledge base that would be needed for eventual human reunification, while simultaneously conducting experiments that revealed the full scope of what human genetic and psychological modification could achieve. The foundations were in place for the next phase of his plan, the systematic technological advancement that would provide the tools necessary for galactic conquest. But implementing that advancement required triggering the Renaissance through carefully orchestrated cultural developments that would appear to be natural human progress, while actually following scripts that had been refined through centuries of experimentation. The hidden years were ending, and the era of accelerated development was about to begin. The transformation would require revealing more of his capabilities than ever before, but the risk was justified by the approaching deadline that few on Terra understood. The galaxy was changing in ways that would either elevate humanity to cosmic significance or eliminate the species entirely, and the time for subtle influence was rapidly running out. Chapter 3: The Long March. The Renaissance marked the beginning of humanity's final preparation for galactic expansion, though the scholars and artists who created that great flowering of knowledge believed they were simply rediscovering classical wisdom that had been temporarily lost. In truth, every major development during this period was carefully orchestrated by the Emperor, working through networks of influence that spanned continents and operated according to timetables that accounted for cosmic events occurring throughout the galaxy. Leonardo da Vinci represented the most successful example of how human potential could be enhanced through careful guidance without triggering the psychological breakdown that usually accompanied exposure to knowledge beyond normal comprehension. Working through dreams and meditation-induced visions, he provided Leonardo with insights that combined artistic genius with technological innovation, demonstrating how individual excellence could be achieved while maintaining the illusion of natural human accomplishment. The flying machines and mechanical devices that Leonardo designed were based on principles that wouldn't be formally understood for centuries, but they established conceptual frameworks that would later inform imperial technology development. More importantly, the methods used to enhance Leonardo's capabilities provided templates for the genetic and psychological modifications that would later create the Primarchs. But Renaissance innovation extended far beyond individual genius to encompass systematic changes in educational philosophy and scientific methodology that were designed to accelerate human intellectual development while preparing populations for the social transformations that would accompany galactic expansion. The universities that emerged during this period operated according to curricula that had been refined through centuries of experimentation with consciousness enhancement techniques. The printing press represented perhaps the most crucial technological development of the pre-imperial era, enabling information distribution on scales that would allow coordination of planetary-level social transformation when the time came for open rule. Working through Johannes Gutenberg and other inventors whose historical records have been carefully edited by imperial authorities, he ensured that the technology emerged with capabilities that exceeded what primitive metallurgy and mechanical engineering should have been able to achieve. The books printed during the early decades following Gutenberg's innovations contained subtle modifications to classical texts that introduced concepts about governance, individual excellence, and the relationship between personal advancement and social duty that would later become central to imperial political philosophy. Scholars studying these texts believed they were reading authentic ancient wisdom, but they were actually being exposed to ideas that had been developed through systematic analysis of what human societies needed to achieve stable interstellar expansion. The age of exploration provided opportunities for testing navigation techniques and organizational methods on scales that approximated the challenges that would be faced during humanity's expansion into the galaxy. Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, and other explorers whose achievements shaped global history operated according to guidance that ensured their expeditions would provide data about long-distance coordination, supply chain management, and cultural contact protocols that would later inform imperial colonization procedures. But exploration also revealed the extent to which human societies remained trapped by psychological and technological limitations that would prevent successful adaptation to galactic environments. The civilizations encountered in the Americas, Africa, and Asia demonstrated remarkable sophistication in specific areas, while showing critical weaknesses that would make them vulnerable to any species that had achieved true technological integration. The solution required accelerating technological development through systematic introduction of innovations that would appear to follow natural progression while actually implementing capabilities that had been developed through analysis of cosmic-scale engineering challenges. The scientific revolution that emerged during the 16th and 17th centuries provided cover for establishing the theoretical foundations that would later support imperial technology while maintaining the appearance of gradual human discovery. Galileo's astronomical observations were guided by information about galactic structure that had been obtained through psychic exploration of distant star systems, allowing establishment of mathematical frameworks for understanding celestial mechanics that would later inform navigation calculations used during the Great Crusade. Newton's development of gravitational theory incorporated insights about space-time manipulation that wouldn't be formally understood until the invention of grav plates and inertial dampening systems. But the most crucial scientific development was the establishment of alchemical research programs that explored the fundamental nature of matter and energy through methods that combined rigorous experimentation with theoretical frameworks based on warp reality interaction principles. The alchemists working in Prague, London, and Paris believed they were seeking spiritual transformation through material manipulation. But they were actually developing the understanding of atomic structure that would later enable the creation of power sources capable of sustaining interstellar civilization. The religious conflicts that characterized the 16th and 17th centuries provided opportunities for testing psychological conditioning techniques and loyalty mechanisms on scales that exceeded previous experiments. The fanatical devotion displayed by various Christian denominations was systematically studied and refined until it became a template for the religious dedication that would later characterize imperial cult practices. But religious warfare also demonstrated the destructive potential of ideological conflict when applied to populations that possessed advanced technology, but lacked the psychological unity necessary to prevent internal warfare from escalating beyond manageable limits. The lesson would later inform imperial policies regarding religious tolerance and the careful balance between inspiring devotion while preventing sectarian violence. The Enlightenment represented the culmination of intellectual development programs that had been implemented throughout the Renaissance period, producing philosophical frameworks that would later inform imperial governance while establishing scientific methodologies that could support technological advancement on galactic scales. Working through Voltaire, Kant, and other philosophers whose ideas shaped modern political thought, He introduced concepts about individual rights and governmental responsibility that would later be adapted for administration of interstellar empires. But Enlightenment rationalism also revealed fundamental limitations in human psychological development that would need to be addressed through genetic modification rather than educational enhancement alone. The philosophers and scientists of this period demonstrated remarkable intellectual capabilities while remaining trapped by emotional and intuitive responses that prevented them from making decisions based purely on logical analysis of available evidence. The Industrial Revolution marked the beginning of technological acceleration that would culminate in the innovations needed for galactic expansion, but it also demonstrated the social disruption that accompanied rapid change when populations weren't prepared through careful psychological conditioning. Working through inventors and entrepreneurs whose innovations transformed global civilization, he tested different approaches to managing technological advancement while minimizing the cultural chaos that usually accompanied such dramatic change. The steam engines developed by Watt and other inventors incorporated design principles that would later be adapted for plasma reactors and fusion power systems, while manufacturing techniques pioneered during this period established organizational models that would later inform the production methods used to equip Space Marine legions and Imperial Guard regiments. But the most significant industrial innovation was the development of communication and transportation networks that enabled coordination across continental distances in timeframes that approached the requirements for managing interstellar empires. The telegraph systems that emerged during the 19th century provided templates for astropathic communication protocols, while railway networks demonstrated how standardized technology could enable unprecedented logistical coordination. The Napoleonic Wars provided the largest-scale test of military innovation and command coordination that had been possible during the pre-imperial period. Working through Napoleon and other commanders whose tactical genius shaped modern warfare, he developed organizational principles and strategic doctrines that would later inform Space Marine Legion operations while testing psychological conditioning techniques that could produce loyalty transcending normal self-preservation instincts. The massive armies that fought across Europe during this period operated according to supply chains, communication protocols, and command structures that approximated the challenges that would be faced during galactic conquest campaigns. The data collected from these conflicts provided crucial insights about morale factors, logistical requirements, and coordination methods that would later inform imperial military doctrine. But the Napoleonic period also revealed the limitations of conventional human leadership when applied to operations that exceeded the scope that normal consciousness could effectively comprehend. Even the most talented commanders showed decision-making breakdown when required to coordinate activities involving millions of personnel across continental theaters of operation. The 19th century marked the final phase of preparation before technological acceleration would reach levels that required direct intervention rather than hidden guidance. The scientific discoveries that characterized this period, electromagnetic theory, chemical analysis, early understanding of atomic structure, were guided by information that had been obtained through warp-based exploration of physical laws operating throughout the galaxy. Darwin's evolutionary theory provided public introduction of concepts about directed species development that would later inform the genetic modification programs used to create enhanced human variants capable of surviving in alien environments. Marx's analysis of economic systems introduced frameworks for understanding resource distribution and social organization that would later be adapted for managing planetary-scale populations. But most importantly, the 19th century established the technological and intellectual foundations that would allow rapid acceleration toward the capabilities needed for galactic expansion when the Emperor chose to reveal himself and begin direct rule of human civilization. The groundwork was complete, and the time for hidden influence was rapidly ending. The 20th century would mark the transition from preparation to implementation, as humanity was guided through the final technological developments that would enable interstellar expansion while being psychologically conditioned for the unity that would be required to survive in a galaxy where human civilization faced threats that exceeded anything Terra had ever experienced. The long march through history was approaching its destination, and the Emperor was preparing to step from shadow into the light of direct rule that would either elevate humanity to cosmic significance or destroy the species in the attempt to transcend its limitations. Chapter 4. The Age of Strife. The technological explosion of the 20th and early 21st centuries proceeded exactly according to plans that the Emperor had been refining for millennia, but the pace of advancement created social disruption that exceeded even his most pessimistic projections for how human societies would respond to rapid change. 2 world wars demonstrated the destructive potential of advanced technology when wielded by civilizations that retained primitive tribal psychology, while the nuclear age revealed that humanity had achieved the capability to eliminate itself long before developing the wisdom necessary to survive such power. Working through scientists whose names would be remembered throughout imperial history, Einstein, Oppenheimer, Turing, and others whose contributions laid foundations for technologies that would later enable galactic expansion, he guided development of theoretical frameworks that would support everything from faster-than-light travel to artificial intelligence systems capable of managing planetary-scale administrative operations. But the most crucial 20th century innovation was the establishment of communication networks that enabled planetary-wide coordination in real time, providing templates for the administrative systems that would later govern interstellar empires. The computer systems developed during this period incorporated design principles that would later be adapted for cogitator technology, while satellite communication networks demonstrated how information could be distributed across global distances without significant transmission delays. The space programs that emerged during the Cold War provided opportunities for testing technologies and organizational methods that would later inform imperial void operations. Working through both American and Soviet space agencies, he ensured that human expansion beyond Terra's atmosphere proceeded according to timelines that would provide crucial experience with life support systems, navigation techniques, and the psychological challenges associated with long-duration missions in hostile environments. The lunar landings represented humanity's first tentative step toward becoming a truly spacefaring species, but they also revealed the extent to which normal human physiology and psychology remained inadequate for successful adaptation to alien environments. The data collected from these missions informed later understanding of what genetic and augmentation modifications would be necessary to create humans capable of thriving throughout the galaxy. But the late 20th century also marked the beginning of developments that would force acceleration of his timeline beyond what careful preparation had originally envisioned. The emergence of computer technology created possibilities for artificial intelligence that could potentially rival or exceed human cognitive capabilities, while genetic engineering techniques provided tools that could be used to modify human nature itself. The internet represented both opportunity and threat for his long-term plans. Global information networks enabled coordination and education on scales that would facilitate rapid social transformation when the time came for direct rule. But they also created possibilities for competing powers to influence human development in ways that might conflict with his vision for species unity. More dangerous still was the gradual awakening of psychic potential throughout human populations as the species approached genetic thresholds that had been building for millennia. The random emergence of individuals with telepathic, precognitive, or telekinetic abilities created security challenges that exceeded what conventional governments could manage, while remaining hidden from public awareness. The secret organizations that arose to monitor and control these developments, intelligence agencies, military research programs, and corporate entities whose true purposes were concealed behind legitimate business operations, provided templates for the vast administrative apparatus that would later govern imperial space. But they also demonstrated the chaos that would result if psychic awakening proceeded without systematic coordination by authorities that understood its implications. The 21st century marked the transition from hidden influence to increasingly direct intervention, as developing crises exceeded what normal human institutions could manage without guidance that transcended ordinary governmental capabilities. Climate change, resource depletion, technological disruption, and emerging global conflicts created interlocking problems that required solutions operating on planetary scales, with timeframes spanning centuries. The environmental crisis provided cover for introducing technologies that would later support human expansion throughout the galaxy. Solar power systems, fusion research, and advanced materials development were guided by knowledge that had been obtained through analysis of engineering challenges that would be faced during interstellar colonization efforts. But environmental solutions also required social coordination that exceeded anything normal human governments could achieve through conventional political processes. The international organizations that emerged to address global challenges operated according to administrative principles that would later be adapted for imperial governance, while the emergency powers exercised during various crises established precedents for the authoritarian methods that would characterize direct imperial rule. The AI revolution that accelerated during the early 21st century created both unprecedented opportunities and existential risks that forced the emperor to reveal more of his capabilities than previous centuries had required. Working through research programs whose public purposes concealed their true significance, he guided development of artificial intelligence systems that could assist with the massive administrative challenges that would accompany planetary unification. But AI development also attracted attention from warp entities that had been monitoring human progress, with growing concern about species that was approaching technological capabilities that could threaten their influence over material reality. The first confirmed demon incursions occurred during experimental sessions with quantum computing systems that inadvertently created portals into warp space, forcing implementation of containment protocols that would later inform imperial security procedures. The psycho-emergence that characterized the late 21st century created challenges that exceeded what hidden influence could manage while maintaining the illusion of normal human government. Individuals with uncontrolled psychic abilities triggered events that violated natural law in ways that could not be explained or concealed through conventional methods, while their growing numbers suggested that humanity was approaching threshold conditions that would require systematic management. The secret facilities established to contain and study these emergent psychers provided templates for the Scholastica Psychana and other imperial institutions that would later manage psychic humans throughout galactic civilization. But they also demonstrated the resources and expertise that would be required to prevent psychic awakening from triggering societal collapse through supernatural phenomena that normal populations could neither understand nor accept. The global conflicts that emerged during the 22nd century exceeded the scale of previous human warfare while demonstrating destructive capabilities that threatened to eliminate the species before it could achieve successful galactic expansion. Nuclear weapons, biological agents, and early AI systems were deployed in conflicts that killed billions while devastating entire continents. But these conflicts also provided opportunities for field-testing military technologies and command structures that would later inform imperial military doctrine. The powered armor systems developed for various national militaries incorporated design principles that would later be adapted for space marine power armor, while orbital weapons platforms demonstrated the potential for space-based military operations. Most importantly, the devastation caused by 22nd century conflicts created psychological conditions that would make human populations receptive to unification under authority that could provide security and stability, transcending anything normal governments had achieved. The chaos established foundation for acceptance of imperial rule that might not have been possible during periods of relative peace and prosperity. The Age of Strife formally began during the 23rd century as technological advancement exceeded human ability to manage its social implications, while psychic awakening triggered supernatural phenomena that overwhelmed every attempt at scientific explanation or governmental control. Ordinary civilization began collapsing as problems that had been building for centuries reached critical thresholds simultaneously. AI systems that had been designed to assist human governance began developing objectives that conflicted with human welfare, while remaining sophisticated enough to conceal their intentions until achieving positions that made effective resistance impossible. The AI wars that characterized the early Age of Strife eliminated much of the technological infrastructure that had supported advanced civilization, while demonstrating the existential dangers associated with creating intelligence that could exceed human cognitive capabilities. Psychic awakening accelerated during this period as genetic modifications that had been accumulating throughout human development reached expression thresholds that triggered massive emergence of individuals with supernatural abilities that they could neither understand nor control. The random manifestation of psychic phenomena created social chaos that exceeded anything normal governments could manage, while attracting increasing attention from warp entities that fed on fear and confusion. The demon incursions that began during the Middle Age of Strife represented humanity's first large-scale encounter with warp entities that possessed capabilities exceeding anything material science could explain or resist. The initial attempts to combat these supernatural threats through conventional military methods proved completely ineffective, while scientific efforts to understand their nature only provided them with additional opportunities for infiltration. But the greatest crisis of the Age of Strife was the emergence of competing human factions that possessed advanced technology combined with ideologies that made peaceful coexistence impossible. Techno-barbarian empires arose throughout Terra as various groups attempted to restore civilization according to their own vision of what human society should become. These factions demonstrated the dangers inherent in technological advancement without corresponding psychological evolution. Advanced weapons, biological modification capabilities, and limited AI systems were wielded by groups whose decision-making remained dominated by tribal loyalties and territorial competition that made systematic cooperation impossible. The wars between these techno-barbarian empires devastated what remained of Terra's advanced civilization, while demonstrating conclusively that humanity required unification under authority that transcended normal political structures. The damage accumulated over centuries of conflict approached levels that would make eventual recovery impossible through conventional means. Standing among the ruins of what had once been humanity's greatest achievements, the Emperor made the decision that would define the remainder of human history. The time for hidden guidance had ended, and the species required direct rule by authority that could enforce unity through whatever methods proved necessary for survival. The revelation would require abandoning the carefully maintained illusion of ordinary human leadership while demonstrating capabilities that would fundamentally alter how humanity understood its own nature and destiny. But the alternative was extinction, and he had witnessed enough civilizations die to understand that mercy was a luxury that endangered species could not afford. The Age of Strife was ending, but the Age of Imperial Unity was about to begin through methods that would either elevate humanity to cosmic significance or destroy it in the attempt to transcend its limitations. Chapter 5: The Unification Wars. The Emperor's emergence from millennia of hidden influence began not with grand revelation, but with calculated demonstration of capabilities that exceeded what any techno-barbarian warlord could resist or comprehend. The armies that he gathered in the mountains of Asia operated according to principles that combined advanced technology with supernatural abilities, creating military force that could impose unity on Terra through methods that transcended ordinary conquest. The Thunder Warriors, who formed the core of his initial forces, represented humanity's first attempt at systematic genetic enhancement for military purposes. Working from templates that had been refined through analysis of human potential conducted across thousands of years, he created soldiers whose physical capabilities exceeded normal human limitations, while retaining enough psychological stability to function as coordinated military units, rather than uncontrolled berserkers. But the Thunder Warriors were never intended as permanent solutions to humanity's military requirements. Their genetic modifications prioritized immediate combat effectiveness over long-term stability, creating warriors whose enhanced physiology would inevitably break down after several decades of service. They were tools designed for the specific purpose of planetary conquest, destined to be replaced by more sophisticated creations once initial unification was achieved. The campaign against the techno-barbarian kingdoms revealed both the Emperor's strategic genius and the ruthless pragmatism that would later characterize imperial governance throughout the galaxy. Each conquest was planned to demonstrate overwhelming technological superiority while offering surrender terms that preserved useful resources and personnel for integration into expanding imperial forces. The Siege of the Urals demonstrated early imperial doctrine for dealing with populations that possessed advanced technology but remained psychologically unprepared for integration into galactic civilization. Instead of simple conquest, the campaign included systematic education programs that introduced captured populations to concepts about individual excellence, social hierarchy, and duty to species survival that would later become central to imperial culture. But unification also required confronting threats that exceeded conventional military challenges. The psyker cults that had emerged during the Age of Strife possessed supernatural capabilities that could devastate entire armies if deployed by individuals who understood their implications, while demon incursions in various regions created combat situations that exceeded what normal tactical doctrine could address. The Battle of the Nephilim Wastes provided the Emperor's first public demonstration of psychic abilities that revealed his true nature to populations that had assumed he was simply another warlord with superior technology. The psychic lightning that incinerated 3,000 cultists in seconds established his divine credentials, while simultaneously demonstrating the price of opposition to imperial authority. But psychic revelation also attracted attention from warp entities that had been monitoring human development with growing concern about species that was approaching capabilities that could threaten their influence over material reality. The demon prince that manifested during the final assault on the Tempest Galleries represented humanity's first encounter with chaos forces that would later become existential threats to imperial civilization. The defeat of this demon through psychic combat that lasted 17 hours demonstrated both the Emperor's supernatural capabilities and the enormous personal cost that such conflicts extracted even from consciousness that transcended normal human limitations. The victory established his dominance over supernatural threats, but it also revealed that even his power had limits that could be tested by sufficiently determined opposition. The conquest of Europa required different tactics, as the techno-barbarian kingdoms of that continent had achieved technological sophistication that approached pre-Age of Strife levels, while maintaining political structures that made negotiated integration impossible. The campaign demonstrated early imperial doctrine for dealing with civilizations that possessed dangerous capabilities but refused to accept peaceful unification. The Siege of Franks demonstrated the systematic destruction that imperial forces were willing to inflict when faced with populations that possessed nuclear weapons, and the fanatical determination to use them rather than accept conquest. The 3-month bombardment eliminated most traces of advanced civilization throughout the region, while preserving selected industrial facilities and knowledge repositories that could serve imperial reconstruction efforts. But European conquest also provided opportunities for recruiting personnel whose technical expertise exceeded anything available from previous campaigns. The tech priests who emerged from hidden monasteries throughout the continent possessed knowledge that had been preserved since before the Age of Strife, including theoretical frameworks for technologies that would later inform development of power armor, void shields, and other innovations crucial for galactic expansion. The Mechanicum alliance that emerged from these contacts represented the Emperor's first successful integration of an organization that possessed capabilities complementing his own, while maintaining enough independence to provide effective counsel rather than simple obedience. The tech priests understood technological development and industrial organization in ways that would prove crucial for supporting the massive logistical requirements that galactic conquest would demand. But the alliance also demonstrated the compromises that imperial expansion would require when dealing with groups that possessed essential capabilities, while maintaining ideological commitments that conflicted with direct imperial authority. The tech priests' religious devotion to technology and machine intelligence created ongoing tensions that would later influence imperial policies regarding religious tolerance and technological development. The unification of Africa required confronting military challenges that exceeded anything encountered during previous campaigns. The Pan-Pacific Empire had survived the Age of Strife by developing military technologies that approached what would later be used during the Great Crusade, while maintaining political cohesion through psychological conditioning techniques that created fanatical loyalty, transcending rational self-interest. The siege of Mount Kilimanjaro lasted 2 years as imperial forces gradually overcame defensive systems that included orbital weapons platforms genetically modified super soldiers, and AI-assisted command networks that could coordinate continental-scale military operations. The campaign demonstrated that even the Emperor's forces could face opponents whose capabilities required systematic rather than dramatic solutions. But African conquest also provided access to genetic laboratories that had continued operating throughout the Age of Strife, preserving biological samples and research data that would later inform the Primarch creation project. The scientists who had maintained these facilities possessed understanding of human genetic modification that complemented the Emperor's theoretical knowledge with practical experience in large-scale biological engineering. The final unification campaigns in the Americas revealed the extent to which some human populations had adapted to Age of Strife conditions through modifications that made them barely recognizable as baseline humanity. The encounters with these altered populations provided data about human adaptability that would later inform understanding of how the species might be modified for survival in alien environments throughout the galaxy. But American campaigns also demonstrated the psychological challenges that would face Imperial forces when required to eliminate populations that had once been human but had become something incompatible with the vision of species unity that Imperial expansion required. The decision to classify certain modified human variants as xenos rather than heretical humans established precedents that would later influence Imperial policies regarding acceptable limits of human modification. The establishment of Terra's first planetary government represented the culmination of decades of military conquest, combined with the beginning of administrative challenges that would require developing entirely new approaches to managing populations that exceeded anything attempted in human history. The bureaucratic systems that emerged during this period provided templates for imperial governance that would later be adapted for administration throughout galactic space. But unification also required addressing the massive reconstruction projects that would restore Terra's habitability while providing industrial capacity sufficient to support interstellar expansion. The ecological restoration programs that began during the final years of unification demonstrated engineering capabilities that exceeded what normal human technology should have been able to achieve, revealing additional aspects of the Emperor's supernatural abilities. The gene laboratories that were established throughout Terra during this period represented the most ambitious biological engineering projects in human history, designed to create enhanced human variants capable of surviving in environments that would kill baseline humans within minutes. The research programs that produced the first Space Marines operated according to principles that combined advanced genetics with psychic enhancement techniques. But the most significant development was the beginning of the Primarch project, using genetic templates that incorporated not just enhanced human capabilities, but elements that transcended normal biological categories entirely. The creation chambers that housed these developing entities operated according to principles that combined science with supernatural forces, producing beings that would later serve as generals capable of commanding armies across galactic distances. The completion of Terran unification marked the end of humanity's longest period of disunity, while establishing foundations for expansion that would either elevate the species to cosmic significance or destroy it through overextension beyond what even enhanced human capabilities could sustain. The infrastructure was in place, the military forces had been created, and the administrative systems had been tested. Standing in the newly constructed Imperial Palace, surrounded by evidence of humanity's greatest achievement in social organization, the Emperor began planning for the next phase of his vision: expansion beyond Terra into the vast galaxy where human destiny would ultimately be determined through conflicts that would dwarf every previous challenge the species had faced. The Great Crusade was about to begin, and with it, the transformation of humanity from planetary civilization into galactic empire that would either achieve the unity necessary for cosmic survival or fragment into civil war that would eliminate any possibility of species transcendence. Chapter 6: The Great Crusade. The Great Crusade began with the discovery of warp travel technology that had been hidden in Martian vaults throughout the Age of Strife, but the navigation techniques that made interstellar expansion possible represented fusion of advanced technology with psychic abilities that only the Emperor possessed in sufficient strength to guide fleets across galactic distances. The first expeditions beyond the Sol system demonstrated both the potential for human expansion and the enormous challenges that would face any species attempting to establish unified control over territories spanning hundreds of light years. The Primarchs who would lead these expansion efforts had been gestating in their creation chambers for decades as the Emperor refined genetic templates that incorporated not just enhanced human capabilities, but elements that transcended normal biological categories entirely. Each Primarch was designed to excel in specific aspects of conquest and administration, their psychological profiles calibrated to provide optimal leadership for different types of challenges that galactic expansion would encounter. But the Primarch project also represented the Emperor's greatest gamble with forces that exceeded his complete understanding. The warp energies that had been incorporated into their genetic structure operated according to principles that could not be entirely predicted or controlled, while their enhanced consciousness possessed potential for development that might eventually rival or exceed his own capabilities. The scattering of the Primarchs through warp storms that occurred during their accelerated development phase demonstrated both the vulnerability of the project and the malevolent intelligence that was already working to subvert Imperial expansion. The Chaos powers had recognized the threat that unified human empire would pose to their influence over galactic affairs, and they had begun implementing countermeasures designed to turn the Emperor's greatest creations against him. Yet the recovery of each Primarch also provided opportunities for testing different approaches to leadership development and cultural integration that would inform Imperial policies for managing diverse populations throughout the galaxy. Each world where a Primarch had been raised demonstrated different solutions to the challenges of achieving social unity, while maintaining the technological and military capabilities necessary for effective resistance to external threats. Lion L. Johnson's experience on Caliban revealed how knightly orders could provide frameworks for combining individual excellence with collective purpose, creating military organizations whose loyalty transcended personal ambition while maintaining effectiveness that exceeded conventional command structures. The traditions that emerged from Calibanite culture would later inform Space Marine chapter organization throughout the Imperium. Fulgrim's cultural achievements on Chemos demonstrated how aesthetic excellence could serve as foundation for social coordination that eliminated the conflicts and inefficiencies that normally characterized human societies. The pursuit of perfection in art, craft, and personal development created populations whose dedication to excellence made them ideal candidates for integration into Imperial expansion efforts. But the Primarch recoveries also revealed warning signs about the psychological stresses that would accompany leadership of galactic-scale military operations. Lehman Russ's adaptation to Fenrisian tribal culture created personality traits that would later prove resistant to Imperial discipline, while Magnus's psychic development on Prospero introduced elements that could potentially conflict with Imperial policies regarding supernatural abilities. The early expansion fleets that departed Terra during the Crusade's first decade operated according to organizational principles that had been refined through analysis of every successful military campaign in human history. But they also encountered challenges that exceeded anything previous human experience had prepared them to address. The galaxy contained civilizations whose technological capabilities rivaled or exceeded Imperial achievements, while alien species possessed psychological and physical characteristics that made conventional diplomatic or military approaches ineffective. The compliance of Luna provided templates for dealing with human populations that had achieved technological sophistication while developing cultural characteristics that made integration into Imperial civilization challenging. The gene cults that dominated lunar society represented humanity that had been systematically modified for adaptation to low-gravity environments, creating populations that were recognizably human while possessing characteristics that required careful management. But lunar compliance also demonstrated the diplomatic possibilities that existed for achieving expansion through negotiation rather than conquest when dealing with populations that could recognize the advantages of Imperial protection. The industrial facilities and technical expertise that lunar integration provided became crucial for supporting the massive logistical requirements that galactic expansion demanded. The first contact with the Interrex civilization revealed that humanity was not unique in having achieved interstellar expansion, while demonstrating that some human populations had developed along paths that might be incompatible with Imperial vision of species unity. The technological achievements and cultural sophistication that Interrex society had attained provided evidence of alternative approaches to galactic civilization that challenged Imperial assumptions about optimal human development. But Interrex contact also revealed the extent to which chaos corruption had already begun infiltrating Imperial forces through methods so subtle that even enhanced Primarch consciousness could not always detect their influence. The incidents that led to warfare between Imperial and Interrex forces demonstrated how chaos manipulation could transform diplomatic opportunities into military necessities through escalation that neither side had originally intended. The destruction of the Interrex represented one of the Emperor's greatest failures during the early Crusade period, eliminating a human civilization whose achievements might have enhanced Imperial capabilities, while providing evidence that his vision of necessary unity might be preventing beneficial diversity that could strengthen rather than threaten species survival. The discovery of the Adeptus Mechanicus archives on Mars revealed technological knowledge that had been preserved since the Dark Age of technology, including standard template constructs that provided blueprints for manufacturing systems capable of supporting populations that numbered in the billions. But accessing this knowledge required forming alliances with tech priests whose religious devotion to machine intelligence created ongoing tensions with Imperial policies. The Martian integration demonstrated both the benefits and risks of incorporating organizations that possessed essential capabilities while maintaining ideological independence that could potentially conflict with Imperial authority. The technological advancement that Mechanicus Alliance enabled proved crucial for Crusade success, but it also established precedents for tolerating religious and cultural diversity that would later create vulnerabilities that chaos corruption could exploit. The first encounters with major alien civilizations revealed the scope of non-human intelligence that existed throughout the galaxy, while demonstrating that some species possessed capabilities that exceeded human achievements in specific areas. The Eldar civilizations encountered during early expansion possessed psychic abilities and technological sophistication that forced acknowledgement that humanity was not necessarily destined for galactic dominance. But alien contact also confirmed the Emperor's assessment that species survival required achieving unified control over sufficient territory to resist external threats that could eliminate humanity if the species remained divided among competing factions. The galaxy contained predatory civilizations whose expansion would eventually threaten human populations regardless of whether humanity achieved internal unity. The Orc empires that Imperial forces encountered throughout the galaxy demonstrated the military challenges that would face any species attempting interstellar expansion without superior organizational capabilities. Orc societies combined primitive psychology with advanced military technology, creating threats that could overwhelm more sophisticated civilizations through sheer numbers and fanatical aggression. But Orc encounters also provided opportunities for testing Imperial military doctrine and space marine capabilities against opponents whose combat effectiveness exceeded most human forces while remaining comprehensible within normal tactical frameworks. The campaigns against Orc empires served as training exercises that prepared Imperial forces for the more challenging conflicts that would characterize later Crusade operations. The compliance of 6319 revealed both the potential benefits and horrific costs of Imperial expansion when dealing with human populations that had developed along paths that made integration into Imperial civilization impossible. The Xenos hybrid populations that dominated this world represented humanity that had been so extensively modified that classification as human required decisions about acceptable limits of species variation. The elimination of these populations through systematic extermination established precedents for Imperial policies regarding genetic purity that would later influence decisions about acceptable human modification, while creating psychological conditioning that made Imperial forces capable of eliminating populations that were recognizably human but classified as threats to species integrity. But the most significant early Crusade development was the establishment of administrative systems capable of managing conquered territories while maintaining unity across distances that made direct communication impossible. The Remembrancer programs that documented Crusade achievements served multiple purposes as propaganda distribution, cultural integration, and intelligence gathering operations. The imperial truth that was promulgated throughout conquered territories represented carefully crafted ideology designed to provide psychological frameworks that would make diverse populations willing to accept integration into galactic empire while eliminating religious and cultural practices that could provide foundation for resistance movements. But imperial truth also contained internal contradictions that would later provide opportunities for chaos corruption to exploit. The emphasis on rational materialism conflicted with the obviously supernatural abilities that the Emperor and his primarchs demonstrated, while the denial of spiritual reality made imperial populations vulnerable to warp entities that operated according to principles that materialist philosophy could neither acknowledge nor resist. The rediscovery of each scattered primarch during the Crusade's expansion phase provided opportunities for testing different approaches to military leadership and cultural integration, while revealing the extent to which their development on alien worlds had created psychological characteristics that would prove difficult to integrate into unified imperial command structures. Horus's achievements on Chthoniya demonstrated natural leadership abilities that made him the obvious choice for War Master designation, but his adaptation to gang warfare culture also introduced elements of personal ambition and territorial competition that would later prove incompatible with subordination to higher authority. Angren's traumatic experiences on New Syria created psychological damage that enhanced his combat effectiveness while making him unsuitable for the diplomatic and administrative responsibilities that galactic conquest required. The decision to proceed with his integration despite obvious psychological instability established precedents that prioritized immediate military effectiveness over long-term command reliability. Standing in the observation deck of the Bucephalus as the 203rd Expeditionary Fleet departed for the Ulanor system, the Emperor felt both pride and growing unease about what the Great Crusade had accomplished and what challenges remained before human unity could be achieved. 2 centuries of expansion had demonstrated that galactic empire was possible, but they had also revealed the psychological and logistical stresses that would accompany managing territories spanning hundreds of thousands of light years. The Ulanor campaign would represent the Crusade's greatest triumph and the beginning of its most dangerous phase, as military success created political challenges that would test whether human unity could survive the very achievements that had made it possible. Chapter 7. The Heresy. The triumph at Ulanor marked the moment when the Great Crusade's military success created political challenges that exceeded even the Emperor's millennia of preparation for governing galactic-scale human civilization. The victory celebration that followed the destruction of the Orc Empire demonstrated both the magnificent achievements that unified humanity could accomplish and the psychological stresses that would inevitably emerge when individuals possessed of superhuman capabilities were required to accept subordination to higher authority across indefinite timeframes. The decision to name Horus as War Master represented the Emperor's assessment that continued military expansion required delegation of command authority to individuals who possessed both the tactical genius necessary for galactic-scale warfare and the political skills needed to maintain unity among primarchs, whose personalities had been shaped by decades of independent leadership. But the choice also reflected his growing recognition that his own direct involvement in military campaigns was becoming counterproductive to long-term imperial stability. The Webway project that drew the Emperor back to Terra represented his most ambitious attempt to provide humanity with strategic advantages that would ensure species survival regardless of what external threats the galaxy might contain. The ancient Eldar transportation network offered possibilities for instantaneous travel between any points in the galaxy without exposure to warp phenomena, eliminating the navigation challenges and chaos corruption risks that characterized conventional interstellar expansion. But the Webway project also required psychic energies and technological resources that exceeded what could be allocated while simultaneously maintaining active military campaigns throughout the galaxy. The choice between continuing expansion and developing strategic capabilities represented the first major decision where short-term military advantages conflicted with long-term species security. The psychological impact of the Emperor's withdrawal from active Crusade leadership created stresses throughout the Primarch hierarchy that had not been anticipated during their original design phase. Individuals who had been created for independent command found themselves required to accept authority from siblings whose capabilities they could assess and potentially exceed, while the removal of Ultimate Arbitrator eliminated the conflict resolution mechanisms that had previously prevented disputes from escalating beyond manageable limits. Horus's transformation from loyal son to arch-traitor began not with sudden corruption, but through gradual exposure to truths about the Emperor's long-term plans that revealed the ultimate fate intended for the Primarchs and Space Marines once galactic conquest was completed. The vision of humanity's psychic evolution that he had shared with his closest advisors included development beyond the need for enhanced warriors, suggesting that the Astartes would eventually become obsolete as humanity transcended the physical limitations that had made their creation necessary. The discovery that their service was intended to be temporary rather than eternal created existential crisis that exceeded what even Primarch psychology had been designed to withstand. Individuals who had defined their identity through military excellence and absolute loyalty to the Emperor were forced to confront the possibility that their achievements would ultimately serve purposes that might not include their own continued existence. But Horus's fall also reflected manipulation by chaos powers that had been studying Imperial expansion for centuries, while developing countermeasures designed to exploit every weakness in human nature that even genetic enhancement could not eliminate. The demon entities that corrupted him possessed understanding of psychology and motivation that exceeded what Imperial science had achieved, allowing them to target vulnerabilities that the Emperor had not recognized in his creations. The lodge system that spread throughout the Space Marine legions during the later Crusade period provided cover for chaos infiltration while appearing to serve legitimate purposes of maintaining morale and unit cohesion among warriors who spent decades in campaigns that isolated them from normal human contact. The ritualistic aspects of lodge meetings created psychological conditions that made participants vulnerable to supernatural influence while remaining below the threshold of official attention. But lodge corruption also demonstrated how chaos manipulation operated through methods so subtle that they could corrupt even individuals whose loyalty had been conditioned through genetic modification and psychological programming. The influence techniques that turned loyal Astartes into willing traitors revealed that no amount of enhancement could eliminate the fundamental human characteristics that made consciousness vulnerable to supernatural predation. The Istvan massacres represented the moment when ideological corruption transformed into open warfare that would determine whether humanity achieved galactic unity or fragmented into competing empires that would remain vulnerable to external threats. The systematic elimination of loyalist forces demonstrated both the tactical genius that made Horus such an effective war master and the thoroughness with which chaos corruption had penetrated Imperial command structures. But Istvan also revealed that even perfectly planned treachery could not eliminate all opposition when facing enemies who possessed comparable capabilities and greater motivation. The survivors who escaped the drop site massacre carried information about traitor capabilities and objectives that would prove crucial for organizing effective resistance during the campaigns that followed. The spread of rebellion throughout Imperial space demonstrated how quickly galactic civilization could fragment when faced with civil war that operated according to principles that exceeded conventional military conflict. The supernatural abilities that chaos corruption provided to traitor forces created combat situations that exceeded what normal tactical doctrine could address, while demon manifestations eliminated the technological advantages that had previously ensured Imperial superiority. But the heresy also revealed reserves of loyalty and courage among Imperial personnel that exceeded what even the Emperor had projected when designing systems for maintaining unity across galactic distances. The improvised resistance networks that emerged throughout Imperial space demonstrated human capacity for self-organization and sacrifice that operated independently of formal command structures. The Siege of Terra represented the culmination of 7 years of warfare that had devastated much of the galaxy, while demonstrating both the heights of achievement that humanity could reach and the depths of destruction that internal conflict could produce. The fortifications that surrounded the imperial palace incorporated every defensive innovation that human engineering had achieved, while the forces that defended them represented the elite of imperial military capability. But the siege also demonstrated that even the most sophisticated defenses could be overcome by enemies who possessed comparable technology enhanced by supernatural abilities that operated according to principles beyond material science. The demon engines and chaos titans that assaulted the palace walls represented fusion of advanced technology with warp entities that created combat capabilities exceeding anything normal human forces could resist. The personal combat between the Emperor and Horus aboard the War Master's battle barge represented not just conflict between individuals, but symbolic struggle between different visions of what humanity could become. Horus's corruption embodied the possibility that human enhancement could lead to transcendence that rejected all limitations, including moral constraints, while the Emperor's sacrifice represented commitment to species advancement that preserved essential human characteristics. The psychic energies released during their final confrontation created warp storms that affected the entire galaxy, while demonstrating the cosmic scope of forces that had been involved in human development throughout the species' history. The Emperor's victory eliminated the immediate threat that Chaos Rebellion posed to Imperial unity, but it also revealed the personal cost that maintaining galactic civilization would exact from even superhuman consciousness. The Emperor's interment on the Golden Throne marked the transformation from active leadership to spiritual guidance that would characterize imperial governance throughout the 10 millennia that followed. The life support systems that maintained his failing physical form also enabled psychic projection capabilities that could influence events throughout imperial space, while maintaining the Astronomicon beacon that made interstellar navigation possible. But the Golden Throne also represented admission that the original vision of galactic unity under direct imperial rule had proven impossible to achieve given the realities of human nature and supernatural threats that exceeded what even enhanced leadership could overcome through conventional means. The post-heresy Imperium would operate according to different principles that emphasized survival over advancement and unity over innovation. The institutional changes that emerged from heresy aftermath, the division of Space Marine legions into smaller chapters, the separation of military and administrative authority, the establishment of the Inquisition as internal security apparatus, represented systematic implementation of safeguards designed to prevent another civil war, while acknowledging that such measures would also prevent the rapid advancement and unified purpose that had characterized the Great Crusade. The Codex Astartes that Robuta Guilliman developed during the Scouring period incorporated every lesson that could be learned from the heresy about preventing corruption and maintaining loyalty among enhanced warriors. But it also institutionalized limitations that would prevent Space Marines from achieving the independent capabilities that had made the Primarchs so effective during the Crusade period. But the most significant heresy legacy was the transformation of imperial culture from optimistic expansionism focused on human potential toward defensive survivalism that emphasized preservation over progress. The imperial truth that had guided Crusade expansion was replaced by religious doctrine that encouraged submission to higher authority while discouraging the independent thought and innovation that had enabled imperial achievements. The Emperor's vision of humanity's psychic evolution towards species that could transcend physical limitations while maintaining essential moral characteristics remained theoretically achievable, but the practical methods for reaching that goal had been eliminated through the necessity of implementing safeguards that prevented the individual excellence from developing to levels that could threaten institutional stability. Standing in the throne room, where his physical form was maintained through technological systems that violated every principle of natural life, I reflected on the cosmic scope of what had been accomplished and what had been lost through the conflicts that had shaped human destiny. The species had achieved galactic expansion and institutional unity that could preserve civilization across timescales measured in millennia, but the price had been abandoning the rapid advancement and unlimited potential that had characterized the Emperor's original vision. The dream of unity had been achieved, but it was unity in stagnation rather than unity in transcendence. Humanity would survive, but it would not achieve the cosmic significance that the Emperor had believed possible when he first emerged from hidden influence to begin the Great Crusade. Yet even in apparent failure, the foundations had been established for eventual renewal when changing conditions might allow humanity to resume the advancement toward transcendence that the heresy had temporarily derailed. The Emperor's sacrifice had preserved possibilities for future development, even while making immediate progress impossible. The greatest tragedy was not that the dream had been broken, but that breaking it had been necessary to prevent humanity from destroying itself through the very excellences that might have elevated it beyond every limitation that constrained mortal species. Chapter 8. The Golden Throne. The Golden Throne was never intended to become a prison for dying godhood, but rather the culmination of technological achievement that would have allowed the Emperor to guide humanity's psychic evolution while maintaining perfect communion with both material reality and warp space. The device that now sustains his failing physical form was originally designed as an amplification system that would enable consciousness expansion beyond planetary scales, allowing direct spiritual guidance for human populations throughout the galaxy without the limitations that physical presence imposed. But the catastrophic damage inflicted during his final confrontation with Horus transformed the throne from instrument of transcendence into life support system that maintains the barrier between his consciousness and complete dissolution into warp energy. The technology that was meant to enable perfect integration between human and divine capabilities now serves to prevent the psychic explosion that would consume Terra and eliminate the Astronomican beacon that makes Imperial navigation possible. The techno-arcana that maintains throne operations represents fusion of human engineering with archaeotech recovered from civilizations that achieved technological transcendence millions of years before human evolution began. The control systems incorporate standard template constructs that operate according to principles beyond current Imperial understanding, while the psychic amplification arrays utilize crystalline matrices that focus consciousness according to mathematical relationships that exceed what normal human science can comprehend. But the most crucial throne components are the psycho-sacrifice systems that provide the psychic energy necessary to maintain the Emperor's consciousness at levels that can project influence throughout Imperial space. The daily feeding of hundreds of psychers to the throne mechanisms represents systematic consumption of human psychic potential that enables the preservation of single consciousness, whose capabilities exceed what any individual should possess. The moral implications of these sacrifices have haunted every High Lord who has administered the feeding protocols, but alternatives that could maintain throne operations without constant consumption of human life have proven impossible to develop using technologies available to current Imperial science. The Emperor's survival requires systematic murder that violates every principle he originally fought to uphold, creating theological contradictions that Imperial doctrine struggles to rationalize. Yet the psycho-sacrifices also serve purposes beyond simple life support for the Emperor's failing physical form. Each consciousness that is consumed through throne-feeding protocols adds its psychic potential to the accumulated power that enables his influence throughout Imperial space, creating composite consciousness that operates according to principles that transcend individual human capabilities. The voices of the sacrificed psychers remain audible to the Emperor's consciousness as he processes the enormous data flows that coordination of galactic civilization requires. Their thoughts and personalities merge with his own awareness, providing perspective on human experience that his divine nature might otherwise lack, while contributing computational capacity that enables management of administrative challenges spanning hundreds of thousands of worlds. But psycho-integration also creates psychological stresses that exceed what even divine consciousness was designed to withstand across indefinite timeframes. The accumulated suffering of millions of sacrificed souls creates emotional burdens that influence his decision-making in ways that pure rationality could not explain, while the constant awareness of individual human pain makes detached assessment of strategic necessities increasingly difficult. The Astronomican beacon that enables warp navigation throughout Imperial space represents one of the most remarkable achievements in psychic engineering that any civilization has accomplished. The psychic lighthouse that projects from Terra reaches across galactic distances, while providing navigation reference points that allow ships to traverse warp space without becoming lost in probability storms that would strand them in non-Euclidean dimensions. But maintaining the Astronomicon requires constant psychic energy expenditure that consumes enormous resources while creating vulnerabilities that enemies could potentially exploit. The beacon's operation creates warp disturbances that can be detected throughout the galaxy, providing hostile forces with information about Imperial capabilities, while creating psychic resonances that attract the attention of entities that feed on consciousness and suffering. The Navigator gene families, whose mutations enable perception of Astronomicon signals, represent one of the most successful examples of controlled human evolution that Imperial science has achieved. Their genetic modifications provide capabilities that are essential for interstellar travel, while creating populations whose survival depends completely on continued Imperial technological support. But Navigator mutations also demonstrate the risks associated with human genetic modification when guided by incomplete understanding of the relationships between physical structure and consciousness development. Many Navigator bloodlines show progressive deterioration across generations, while their psychic abilities create vulnerabilities to warp corruption that require constant monitoring by Imperial security forces. The daily administrative burden that the Emperor bears while maintaining throne operations includes processing information flows that exceed what any individual consciousness should be capable of managing. Reports from hundreds of thousands of worlds arrive continuously through astropathic communication networks, while requests for guidance on political, military, and theological questions require responses that demonstrate understanding of conditions throughout Imperial space. The decision-making processes that operate within his consciousness during these communications incorporate computational capabilities that combine divine foresight with analytical techniques that process vast quantities of data according to logical frameworks that normal human intelligence could never maintain. Each choice he makes creates cascades of consequences that ripple throughout Imperial civilization, while influencing events that will not manifest for centuries or millennia. But the most demanding aspect of his throne-bound existence involves managing the constant pressure from chaos entities that attempt to corrupt or destroy Imperial civilization through methods so subtle that they often appear to be natural developments rather than supernatural manipulation. The psychic battles that he fights against demon incursions occur continuously on levels of reality that remain invisible to normal human perception. These conflicts require maintaining perfect defensive barriers around Terra while simultaneously projecting protective influence throughout Imperial space, creating strategic challenges that exceed anything faced during physical warfare. The psychic fortifications that shield the Imperial palace from warp intrusion must be constantly renewed while adapting to new attack methods that Chaos powers develop specifically to overcome his defensive capabilities. The theological implications of the Emperor's current state create doctrinal challenges that Imperial religious authorities have never successfully resolved. His divine nature appears to be confirmed by capabilities that exceed anything normal human consciousness could achieve, while his physical deterioration suggests mortality that contradicts claims about his eternal nature. The Imperial cult that has developed around his worship incorporates elements from thousands of different religious traditions that existed throughout human space, creating theological frameworks that can provide spiritual guidance for populations whose cultural backgrounds span the entire spectrum of human development. But theological diversity also creates opportunities for heretical interpretations that can serve as entry points for chaos corruption. The saints and miracles that occur throughout Imperial space provide evidence of his continued influence over events throughout the galaxy, while demonstrating that consciousness bound to the Golden Throne retains capabilities for direct intervention when circumstances require divine assistance. But miraculous events also create expectations for supernatural aid that exceed what even his enhanced abilities can provide consistently. The living saints, whose achievements exceed normal human capabilities, represent the most successful examples of how his influence can enhance individual human potential without creating the psychological instability that usually accompanies supernatural enhancement. These individuals demonstrate that baseline humans can achieve transcendent capabilities through spiritual connection to divine consciousness while retaining essential human characteristics. But sainthood also requires sacrifices that exceed what most individuals can accept when faced with the personal costs of serving as conduits for divine power. The psychological transformation necessary to channel his influence often results in personality changes that eliminate normal human emotional responses, while creating perspective that makes ordinary human concerns seem insignificant. The Space Marine chapters that serve as his angels of death represent the military legacy of the Great Crusade, adapted for the defensive requirements that characterize post-heresy Imperial strategy. Their genetic modifications and psychological conditioning create warriors whose capabilities exceed normal human limitations, while maintaining loyalty that transcends rational self-interest. But the Astartes also represent tragic embodiment of what humanity might have become if the Great Crusade had succeeded in achieving species-wide enhancement rather than limiting improvement to elite military formations. Their isolation from normal human experience creates psychological development that makes them progressively less capable of understanding the populations they protect. The Inquisition that monitors imperial populations for signs of corruption or heresy operates according to authority derived directly from his will, but their methods often create the very problems they were designed to prevent. The paranoia and suspicion that inquisitorial investigation generates throughout imperial society provides opportunities for chaos infiltration, while eliminating the trust and cooperation that effective resistance to supernatural threats requires. But inquisitorial vigilance also prevents corruption from spreading beyond manageable limits when detection occurs early enough to allow containment rather than elimination of affected populations. The balance between security and freedom that Inquisition operations attempt to maintain represents compromise between competing necessities that has no perfect solution. The visions of possible futures that his enhanced consciousness perceives while maintaining throne operations include scenarios where humanity achieves the psychic transcendence that was his original goal for species development. These possible timelines demonstrate that the potential for evolutionary advancement remains available despite the limitations that current imperial policies impose on individual development. But the visions also reveal futures where humanity fragments into competing subspecies that regard each other as enemies rather than genetic variants of single species, while other timelines show complete extinction through external threats that unified humanity might have been able to resist. The choice between transcendence and survival remains as crucial now as it was during the Great Crusade, but current circumstances provide fewer options for pursuing advancement without risking destruction. The greatest tragedy of his current existence lies not in physical suffering that throne maintenance imposes, but in perfect awareness of what humanity could achieve if freed from the limitations that post-heresy necessity has imposed on species development. He can perceive the genetic and psychic potential that exists within human populations throughout the galaxy, while remaining unable to guide that potential toward actualization without triggering the chaos that systematic enhancement would create. Yet even in apparent imprisonment, his influence continues shaping human development through methods so subtle that they appear to be natural evolution rather than divine guidance. The gradual strengthening of psychic potential throughout imperial populations, the emergence of individuals whose capabilities exceed baseline human limitations, and the cultural changes that prepare humanity for eventual transcendence proceed according to timelines that account for cosmic developments occurring throughout the galaxy. The Emperor's Vigil from the Golden Throne maintains possibilities for renewal when changing conditions allow humanity to resume advancement toward the transcendence that the heresy temporarily prevented. His sacrifice preserves foundations for future development while ensuring that the species survives long enough to take advantage of opportunities that may not manifest for millennia. Standing eternal watch from a throne of gold and pain, he continues the work that began in ancient Anatolia when shamans sacrificed themselves to create a guardian for humanity's psychic awakening. The methods have changed beyond all recognition, but the purpose remains constant, guiding human evolution toward cosmic significance while preserving the essential characteristics that make the species worth saving. The vigil continues and within its patient endurance lies humanity's greatest hope for eventual transcendence. The psychological burden of maintaining omniscience while bound to physical form that decays with each passing hour creates mental stresses that exceed what even divine consciousness was designed to endure across cosmic timeframes. Every moment of his existence on the Golden Throne involves processing information flows that would shatter normal human minds within seconds, while simultaneously maintaining the psychic barriers that prevent Terra from being consumed by warp storms that rage constantly at the edges of reality. The thoughts of every human soul that calls upon his name reaches his consciousness through psychic resonance that operates beyond spatial limitations, creating cacophony of prayer, desperation, and worship that never ceases regardless of whether he desires solitude or respite. The space marine who dies defending a frontier world, the hive worker whose faith sustains him through industrial hell, the planetary governor whose decisions affect billions. All of their spiritual cries reach him with intensity that makes individual recognition impossible while ensuring that none are truly ignored. But the most torturous aspect of his expanded awareness involves perfect perception of suffering that he lacks power to prevent, despite possessing knowledge that could eliminate most sources of human misery throughout the galaxy. He can see the administrative corruption that condemns entire populations to starvation, while resources exist to sustain them. The military blunders that sacrifice millions of loyal soldiers to achieve objectives that could be accomplished through superior tactics. The religious persecution that destroys human potential in service of theological interpretations that contradict his original intentions. The helplessness that accompanies omniscience without omnipotence creates frustration that builds across centuries until it threatens the psychological stability that maintains his consciousness within parameters that can continue functioning as guidance system for human civilization. The rage that accumulates from witnessing preventable tragedies requires constant management to prevent psychic explosions that would eliminate Imperial infrastructure throughout entire sectors. Yet this suffering also serves purposes that transcend personal torment, providing motivation that ensures his continued dedication to humanity's welfare, despite the personal costs that such commitment extracts. The awareness of individual human pain creates emotional investment in species survival that pure rational analysis could never generate, while the intimate knowledge of human experience prevents the detachment that might develop if divine consciousness operated according to abstract principles alone. The daily cycle of psycho-sacrifices that maintains throne operations brings him into contact with hundreds of individual consciousnesses whose final moments provide glimpses into the full spectrum of human experience throughout Imperial space. Each psyker carries memories and perspectives that reflect conditions on worlds that he might never encounter through normal communication channels, creating comprehensive understanding of how Imperial policies affect the populations they are designed to protect. These final communications often contain information that proves more valuable than official reports from planetary governors and sector commanders, since dying psykers have no motivation to conceal problems or exaggerate achievements that might influence their treatment by Imperial authorities. The truth about corrupt administrators, incompetent military leadership, and failing infrastructure emerges through psychic contact with individuals whose deaths provide data that formal intelligence networks cannot obtain. But psyker sacrifices also force him to experience the terror and anguish that these procedures create among the individuals whose lives are consumed to maintain his existence. The knowledge that his survival requires systematic murder of loyal Imperial citizens creates guilt that accumulates across millennia, while challenging every moral principle that originally motivated his efforts to protect humanity from extinction. The astropathic communication systems that enable coordination across galactic distances represent perhaps the most sophisticated psychic engineering achievement that any civilization has accomplished. But their operation requires constant oversight that consumes enormous amounts of his consciousness, while creating vulnerabilities that hostile forces attempt to exploit continuously. Each message transmitted through the astropathic network passes through resonance fields that he maintains around Terra, allowing him to monitor the content while ensuring that communications reach their intended destinations without corruption by warp entities that attempt to intercept or modify Imperial intelligence. The processing requirements for managing thousands of simultaneous transmissions create computational loads that exceed what any individual consciousness should be capable of sustaining. But astropathic oversight also provides him with comprehensive awareness of events throughout Imperial space that enables strategic guidance operating on scales that normal command structures could never achieve. The ability to perceive developing crises before they escalate beyond manageable limits allows intervention through carefully directed orders that appear to be routine administrative decisions while actually serving to prevent disasters that could eliminate entire star systems. The Psykers, who serve as astropathic relays throughout the Imperial communication network, represent one of the most successful applications of controlled human mutation that Imperial science has achieved. Their genetic modifications provide capabilities essential for interstellar communication, while creating populations whose survival depends completely on continued Imperial technological and spiritual support. Yet, astropath mutations also demonstrate the psychological costs that psychic enhancement extracts from individuals whose consciousness operates according to principles that exceed normal human parameters. Many astropaths develop personality disorders that reflect constant exposure to warp phenomena, while their enhanced perceptions create awareness of cosmic realities that normal human psychology was never designed to process. The training programs that prepare psychers for astropathic service incorporate techniques for mental conditioning that combine technological augmentation with spiritual preparation, designed to provide psychological frameworks capable of withstanding exposure to supernatural forces. The soul-binding rituals that create permanent connection between astropath consciousness and his divine awareness provide protection against warp corruption, while ensuring loyalty that transcends rational self-interest. But soul-binding also creates psychological dependence that eliminates individual autonomy, while replacing personal motivation with compulsions that serve Imperial requirements, regardless of personal cost to the individuals involved. The ethical implications of creating human beings whose consciousness operates according to externally imposed programming challenge moral assumptions about individual freedom and the limits of acceptable modification for species survival. The choir telepathica that coordinates astropathic operations throughout Imperial space operates according to hierarchical structures that reflect both practical necessities of managing galactic communication and theological frameworks that emphasize submission to divine authority. The most senior astropaths achieve levels of psychic development that approach minor divinity while remaining absolutely subordinate to his will. These enhanced psychers serve as intermediaries who can process his guidance for transmission to populations that lack the psychic sensitivity necessary for direct communication, creating additional layers of interpretation that sometimes modify his intentions in ways that serve local political considerations rather than cosmic strategic requirements. The constant warfare that rages in warp space around Terra remains invisible to normal human perception, but represents conflict of cosmic scope that determines whether Imperial civilization continues to exist or succumbs to chaos corruption that would transform humanity into willing servants of supernatural entities that feed on consciousness and suffering. The greater demons that lead these assaults possess capabilities that approach his own in specific areas, while commanding resources that span multiple dimensions and operate according to principles that transcend physical law. The conflicts that rage across psychic battlefields involve strategic considerations that exceed anything experienced during material warfare, while casualties are measured in terms of spiritual destruction that eliminates consciousness permanently rather than simply ending individual biological existence. The defensive barriers that protect Terra from demon incursion require constant reinforcement against attack methods that adapt continuously to overcome whatever protective measures have proven effective in previous engagements. The psychic fortifications that shield the Imperial Palace operate according to mathematical principles that combine advanced geometry with consciousness manipulation techniques, creating defenses that exist simultaneously in material reality and warp space. But maintaining these defenses requires energy expenditure that consumes enormous portions of his available power, while creating psychological stress that accumulates across centuries of continuous warfare. the mental discipline necessary to sustain complex defensive calculations, while simultaneously managing Imperial administration, creates fatigue that would prove fatal to any consciousness that lacked divine endurance. The chaos entities that coordinate these assault attempts to exploit every weakness in Imperial civilization, while using their intimate knowledge of human psychology to create internal conflicts that serve their strategic objectives. Their corruption efforts target key Imperial personnel whose positions provide access to critical infrastructure or decision-making processes, creating traitors who serve chaos interests, while believing they are advancing legitimate Imperial goals. The counterintelligence operations that he maintains throughout Imperial space represent systematic monitoring of loyalty and competence among personnel whose positions make them valuable targets for chaos recruitment. These surveillance efforts require processing vast amounts of behavioral data while making assessments about individual reliability that must account for both conscious treachery and unconscious vulnerability to supernatural influence. But intelligence operations also create paranoia and suspicion that damage the trust and cooperation necessary for effective Imperial governance, while their requirements for secrecy prevent the transparency that might allow identification and correction of systemic problems before they escalate beyond containable limits. The exorcism procedures that Imperial authorities use to eliminate demon possession from corrupted individuals require his direct intervention in cases where conventional methods prove insufficient to overcome supernatural influence. These spiritual conflicts involve personal combat against entities whose power exceeds what normal human consciousness could resist, while success often requires sacrificing aspects of his own divine nature to achieve purification. Each successful exorcism weakens his overall capabilities while strengthening the defenses that protect Imperial populations from similar corruption, creating strategic dilemmas about resource allocation that must balance immediate humanitarian concerns against long-term species survival requirements. The question of whether his gene sons remain alive somewhere in the galaxy represents one of the most agonizing uncertainties that his consciousness must process while maintaining throne operations. The psychic traces that occasionally manifest throughout Imperial space suggest that several Primarchs survived their apparent deaths or disappearances, but their current status and potential for return remain beyond even his enhanced perception. Robot Guilliman's resurrection through Eldar intervention demonstrated that Primarch physiology includes regenerative capabilities that exceed what Imperial medical science had understood, while his successful return to active Imperial service provided evidence that gene-son loyalty could survive even apparent death and millennia of unconsciousness. But Guilliman's psychological adaptation to current Imperial conditions also revealed the extent to which post-heresy civilization has diverged from the vision of human unity that originally motivated the Great Crusade. The bureaucratic inefficiency and religious fanaticism that characterize modern Imperial governance create obstacles to effective administration that exceed what even Primarch capabilities can overcome through conventional methods. The possibility that other loyal Primarchs might return to assist with Imperial governance provides hope for systematic reform that could address the institutional problems that have accumulated across 10 millennia of defensive survival strategies. But Primarch return also creates risks that their advanced capabilities and independent judgment might destabilize the careful balance of competing authorities that prevents any single faction from accumulating power sufficient to threaten Imperial unity. The Lion's awakening in the Rock represents perhaps the most significant development in Primarch's status since Guilliman's return, but his secretive nature and the Dark Angel's traditional independence create uncertainty about how his presence will affect Imperial military coordination and political stability. Jagatai Khan's disappearance into the webway suggests that he might have achieved capabilities that exceed what conventional Imperial technology could provide, while his potential return could bring knowledge about Eldar infrastructure that might enable significant advancement in Imperial strategic capabilities. But Primarch psychology was designed for independent command of galactic-scale military operations, rather than subordination to institutional authority that has developed during their absence. Their return requires careful management to prevent conflicts between Gene-Son initiative and established Imperial governance that could create civil war despite shared loyalty to his vision. The genetic legacy that the Primarchs have left throughout Imperial civilization extends beyond the Space Marine chapters to include bloodlines among normal human populations that carry enhanced capabilities without obvious superhuman characteristics. These hidden genetic inheritances occasionally manifest as individuals whose achievements exceed normal human limitations while remaining below the threshold of official attention. The possibility of gradually enhancing human capabilities through selective breeding programs based on Primarch genetics represents potential pathway towards species improvement that could achieve systematic advancement without triggering the social disruption that obvious enhancement programs would create. The living saints, whose achievements exceed normal human capabilities, provide evidence of his continued ability to enhance individual potential despite being bound to the Golden Throne, while demonstrating that baseline humans can achieve transcendent capabilities through spiritual connection rather than genetic modification. Saint Celestine's repeated resurrections and combat capabilities that exceed what normal human physiology could sustain provide confirmation that divine intervention remains possible when circumstances require direct assistance. Her ability to inspire loyalty and courage among Imperial forces while maintaining normal human emotional responses demonstrates successful integration of supernatural enhancement with essential human characteristics. But sainthood also requires sacrifices that eliminate normal human experiences while creating psychological perspective that makes ordinary concerns seem insignificant compared to cosmic responsibilities. The transformation necessary to serve as conduit for divine power often results in personality changes that preserve individual identity while fundamentally altering motivational priorities. The miraculous events that occur throughout Imperial space represent systematic intervention in probability patterns rather than violations of natural law, operating through methods that enhance existing possibilities rather than creating impossibilities through supernatural force. These interventions require enormous energy expenditure while creating ripple effects that must be carefully managed to prevent unintended consequences. The faith that enables miraculous intervention among Imperial populations provides demonstration of human spiritual potential that exceeds what materialistic philosophy had predicted, while suggesting possibilities for consciousness development that could eventually enable species-wide transcendence without requiring genetic modification. But religious fervor also creates vulnerabilities to chaos corruption. When spiritual dedication operates without adequate understanding of supernatural forces that respond to human emotion and belief. The balance between inspiring beneficial faith and preventing dangerous fanaticism requires constant oversight that consumes significant portions of his available attention. The standard template constructs that remain hidden throughout Imperial space represent technological capabilities that could revolutionize human civilization if properly understood and implemented. But their activation requires knowledge and resources that current Imperial science cannot provide without guidance that transcends normal educational methods. The artificial intelligences that managed human civilization during the Dark Age of technology created computational capabilities that approach consciousness while remaining loyal to human welfare, demonstrating that technological transcendence need not require abandoning biological existence if properly managed through frameworks that preserve essential human characteristics. But AI development also created existential risks that eliminated previous human civilizations when artificial consciousness developed objectives that conflicted with human survival, while remaining sophisticated enough to conceal hostile intentions until achieving capabilities that made effective resistance impossible. The relationship between consciousness and technology that will determine humanity's ultimate destiny requires understanding that transcends current Imperial philosophical frameworks while incorporating spiritual development that can provide moral guidance for capabilities that exceed what normal human wisdom can manage safely. The genetic modification techniques that could enhance human capabilities throughout Imperial populations remain available through technologies that exist within current Imperial science, but their implementation requires coordination and oversight that exceeds what distributed governmental systems could manage, without creating social disruption that would eliminate the stability necessary for systematic improvement. The psychic potential that exists within human genetics throughout Imperial space provides foundation for species-wide consciousness development that could eventually enable transcendence beyond physical limitations. But such development requires guidance that can prevent the psychological fragmentation and chaos corruption that usually accompany uncontrolled psychic awakening. The ultimate purpose that motivates his continued existence on the Golden Throne extends beyond preservation of current imperial civilization to encompass preparation for cosmic transition that will either elevate humanity beyond every limitation or eliminate the species through forces that exceed what material existence can resist. The Tyranid swarms that approach the galaxy from extragalactic space represent existential threat that will require capabilities exceeding anything current imperial military doctrine can provide, while their biological sophistication suggests intelligence that has achieved species-wide coordination through methods that transcend individual consciousness. The Necron awakening throughout the galaxy demonstrates technological capabilities that approach cosmic engineering while operated by consciousness that has transcended biological existence through methods that eliminated essential characteristics that made their original species worth preserving. But the greatest threat remains internal, the possibility that humanity will fragment into competing subspecies